This podcast is a part of the More Podcast Network.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Daily Leader Podcast by Pattern Talent, where we interview great leaders and we seek to understand leadership. I'm Brad McDonald.
And I'm Taylor Jessup, and we really hope that you enjoy this episode. Welcome back, everybody. We have made it for another amazing episode of The Daily Leader. Taylor Jessup and my co-host, Brad McDonald over here, are rocking and ready today to welcome on a really, really good friend of mine who Josh is going to be introduced by Brad here in just a moment. Before we get there, a couple quick things, couple people we always like to mention. Jesus with Video Pilot. If you're into podcasting or need any video editing needs, check him out. He will be in the show notes. April Norris, she has graciously given us the incredible intro music you just heard, as well as that will outro the podcast there. We also have our sponsor at Ellery May. I really like her. She's my wife. Check out that website. It is currently actually down as we are about to have some twins, which is exciting news. So you cannot purchase candles at this exact moment, but they will be coming. So if you are a fan of the Daily Leader and you've got the Daily Leader tattoo on your inside of your arm or outside of your, this happens. I've seen it. I've seen it. Yep. People have the Daily Leader tattoo there. If you do, hey, if you take a minute, like, subscribe, follow us, Instagram, TikTok, any of your podcasting places, Spotify, Apple,
YouTube. Shout out to YouTube.
Please take a minute and follow us. That would be super helpful for us. With that, Brad, I'm super excited today.
Today is really exciting.
Yeah, it is. Josh is here. He doesn't actually live in Arizona, but we're with him live in flesh. In the flesh. Like
that's right.
He's actually here.
And today we are at Scottsdale Podcast Studio.
Yeah, which is great.
Really exciting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. You can tell they've got a
getting 1% better every time.
1%.
Which we're very grateful to those guys for hosting us today.
Yeah,
Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Welcome, man.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you. Listeners, you are in for a very exciting podcast. This is our friend Josh Kalsbeek, and he has been a tremendous encouragement to Taylor and I, both personally as well as professionally, as we've launched the Daily Leader. He is the best question asker that I know. I can say that with 100% confidence. Would you agree with that? Do you know someone who asks
It's a little
better
hurtful
questions
that you didn't say me, to be honest.
You're growing. You'll get there.
Someday.
But you're not quite on Josh's. Not quite on Josh's level.
Yeah. And there it is. There's the question that just proved that he is good. Okay. Yes, he's a very intentional question asker. He's fantastic at his job, but he's good at it both ways. I think he's great in his job, which I haven't had professional counseling from him, but I know as a friend, incredibly intentional questions that get to the heart of what's going on a consistent basis.
And he is a licensed psychotherapist, and so that's been his training. He's also a writer, and I'm not going to talk too much about the book that you're writing. We'll let you do that when you're good and ready, but he is in the midst of writing a book. He's also a podcaster, and you can find his podcast by searching Words of Wisdom in the Apple Podcast app or any other podcasting app. And in addition to that, he maintains a private practice at joshkalsbeek.com, where you can get more information about how to get on his schedule if you're interested in any of his services. Previously, Josh served to help co-found a platform that helped over 300,000 people in recovery from pain, from trauma, from addiction, to ultimately engage in the healing that recovery has to offer. And I think what I'm most excited about for Josh is just his overall mission, which is to help people experience the transformational power of pursuing wisdom. And so we are really excited to introduce Josh to you today. I would love for you to answer your favorite question, which is to tell us your story and fill in some of those gaps.
Yeah, for any good therapist, I would say it's often the least favorite question because, you get comfortable talking about other people. Yeah. My story, I could tell it 1,000 different ways, but one way to describe it is that, let's see, I'll start with kind of a pivotal moment. I was in West Africa, and I just, in college, and was serving there, building schools, and just had a an overwhelming desire to really, you could say like a calling kind of happened in that moment. And I'll never forget that moment where I just felt called to serve people. I did not know what that meant at that point, but that really was a foundational moment in my life. And at the time I was majoring in art with an option in multimedia, and was like, okay, well, how do I serve people with art? Almost dropped out.
I did not know
this was 20 years ago, and thankfully I did get the degree. That was good, not to just drop out with no idea of what to do next. But really that sent me on almost a decade search of, okay, what does it mean? How do I really help people most? And through the years, through 6 years of grad school and lots of searching, once I started receiving therapy myself, realized like, oh, this is really where I can serve people, because often when people are coming to therapy, they're faced with, I've tried this on my own, and I'm really faced with my greatest struggle, whatever that might be, and how do I overcome that? So that's what I wanted to devote my life to. So that's what I do today.
That's awesome.
I love that, man. You are so servant-hearted and really gifted at figuring out, hey, how do I help this person become the best version of themselves? And I know for you and I, okay, now we go back a while now when I think about it, and it's kind of unreal of
I think it's 8 years.
it is, yeah. It's basically 8 years. Most people, Josh and I are very consistent pen pals for sure.
It's true.
The modern day pen pal of like text messages, we check in, we talk with each other pretty much every day for 8 years. That's a lot of text messages back and forth.
That's a lot.
Yeah. And I know you have helped me grow tremendously in my journey, even though I have not been a part of your practice. So one of the questions we had, and one of the things that I want to know, and one of the reasons we wanted to bring you in this show. So all of our listeners most likely are here to grow, right? If you're listening to the Daily Leader, you're probably not, it's not that we're not funny, because we're very funny.
I'm very funny.
In your own minds,
In
you're
my own
very
way,
funny.
yeah.
But the saying is, you're only as funny as your audience. So
That's
you can let
That's correct.
your listeners decide.
My kids think I'm funny.
I
That's-
think
that's
I'm
good.
funny, and that is all that matters to me.
I think you're funny.
Thank you. I thought I was waiting for like the looking or something like that. But those that are coming onto our podcast are really wanting to grow. So what I wanted to know to kind of start off, to open us up here is, okay, so why is it, okay, all these people that are coming in and listening to the show and wanting to grow, why is it so difficult to grow and become what I am capable of being? What holds me back? Why is that difficult? You can take that whichever way you want.
It's a good question. Why is it difficult to grow? So there's probably many ways we could answer that, and different facets. So I'll try and touch on a few. One way to think about it would be that we won't say just you to pick on you, but
Sure,
just
you can
just
pick on me
for-
too.
Oh, I
That's
would
okay.
love for us to pick on Taylor.
Yeah.
we don't want to make this the Pick on Taylor show, but
Or do
Just-
That's Brad's favorite.
okay, I don't. So
That's fine.
humans in general, you could say one reason is maybe you have poor models. Like if you don't have the right heroes, if you don't have people that you look up to that are real examples to you, then you essentially develop a poor map, right? Because you won't learn what good looks like, right? If that's not modeled for you. And our brains are wired to, from our children who think we're funny, right? To, which you'll find that out soon with your twins that are on the way, right? They will think that you're funny. So at least 2 people in the world will think that you're funny for at least a period of time.
I
It
can't
won't
wait.
last very long.
I can't.
But the way
wait.
our brains are wired is to observe and mimic, right? That's a crucial way that we learn as humans. And so I think that's one way to start is if, say, growing up, we learned to, and not maybe with words, but it was modeled to us to not set goals, right? Or to down talk our desires, right? Or to not talk about our feelings. Then there's all sorts of beliefs that develop. So then you could say there's maybe poor beliefs, right? Or a poor narrative of the stories that we tell that we tell ourselves. You could also say, and we have like an hour here, right? So we only have an hour to answer this one question. Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, there's actually no other questions.
Yeah, that's the one.
Because we could
just
talk
buckle
about
up.
this the whole time.
Yeah, no,
I
I
think that that's really good. I think you bring up a really good point about imitation, and as even going back to our very first episode, it was just Taylor and I kind of chopping it up on what is leadership, how does it work, how does it function, and one of the key aspects that we did dialogue about, and that I work with clients on all the time, is this exact conversation that we can't really, as weird as it sounds, we can't really become the leader that we're capable of becoming if we don't have people show us how to be like that person. And so I think not only in leadership development, but in personal development and just growth in general, this is critical.
Yeah.
Having the right models completely opens the door to actually becoming the person you're created to be and capable of being. Just so counterintuitive.
And yet, like, the flip side of that coin is that we all have to walk our own path,
Totally.
right? So there's the observing others, and then we have to really, to truly grow, we have to live out whatever that goal is. And I say goal in the sense of, like, if you break down just to the most basic level, you may be at point A, wherever that is, and desire to go to point B, whether that's to eat for the day or to launch a company or to tackle a specific issue in work or whatever that is, right? Essentially, you're at point A and you desire to go to point B, and so there's an element where only you can take that step or those many steps to grow, and so that's where you may have a good model, but also, what narrative are you telling yourself? How do you see yourself, right? If your identity is not strong enough to grow into that desired outcome, you may self-sabotage because, right, you don't believe you deserve to grow, essentially, to
so
accomplish. And so that would be, we could say, shame.
When we did our prep call, did we talk all about the idea of telos?
We did not.
T-E-L-O-S. Are you familiar with telos? I remember you pointing me to Aristotle in the virtues. But like this idea of telos is actually something that Dr. Benjamin Hardy, who wrote the book Be Your Future Self Now, talks about a lot. And it's just the fact that all observable things are moving towards an end. They're progressing, they're advancing forward towards goals. And so I think about that a lot. Number one, because I use that book for all my clients, but number two, because it's so true to experience. Like every morning I wake up and I think about that which I'm trying to achieve. And when you lack clarity on that, it's so difficult to grow. Which way do you grow? What do you end up becoming if you don't have a sense of clarity around what your goals are? So I think I'm hearing you say imitation is critical. So when we don't have good models, we ultimately don't grow and become wise. And then we don't have clear goals.
Yeah, and we may think we have good models, right? Like that's one of the dynamics I think is in the business world. You may, I think, be very, I guess advice would be very careful who you choose as your model, right? Because you may find many of my clients have climbed the ladder of success, experienced a lot of success, and then gone like, this is actually really empty, right? Because they didn't get the fundamentals right, you could say, in terms of what is most important. Because I think you can actually and maybe need to prioritize what is most meaningful, what is most important in life. And so in maybe not intentionally or consciously initially, but in the desire to succeed in the world, to grow in your career, it's easy to start to put that as like the highest good. And if that's the case, then it will inevitably lead to letdown. So you might actually be successful in the growth in that desired outcome, and then realize that's not the deepest good. And so that then would lead all of us to be empty, to feel regret, and likely to hurt others along the way.
And what you're saying, Josh, reminds me of that phrase. I think you may have told me this one.
Probably. Wait,
ladder,
go on.
Putting your ladder on the wrong wall.
I don't think I've ever said that in my life.
No,
But
have you
I'll-
heard it?
No.
Have you heard it?
Go on.
Sometimes we make the mistake of putting our ladder on the wrong wall, and you totally said that to me, not Taylor. That's you told me that, and so I kind of hear you saying that as well, like kind of the downside to not having clarity on goals, or maybe not having healthy goals, good goals, is that we ultimately spend all of this time focusing on something that's really not the best thing. It's really not as important as maybe we made it out to be in our minds, or at least not as sustainably important or valuable ethically.
And I would say it's not that like career success is not a good goal, right? Like that's a great goal, and I think a lot of good things can happen when we pursue something meaningful like success in our career. It's the challenge would be if that becomes the highest desired goal in life, right? Then essentially the ends justify the means, right? To where you start to say, well, anyone that's in my way, I'm going to, it becomes a very aggressive, and you could say in terms of game theory, right? Like it's not an open-ended game that leads to abundance, where you can actually serve people and that leads to better outcomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think I don't want to in any way say seeking success in a career is a bad thing. It's what is it at the expense of, right? Or is there something more fundamental to also approach or pursue that? Because what happens if you're not successful and you don't reach your goals? Then do you have no joy, right? Or is the ultimate point to achieve the goals, or is it to be on the journey, so to speak, to be striving towards what is good?
Well, I love the way you articulate that, Josh, as you share your mission in life. Your mission in life is the transformational power of pursuing wisdom. That the degree to which we obtain it is probably very different depending on the person that you're working with. But there's transformational power in the pursuit of it alone. And I love that about you. I love how you help people do that. I love how you've helped me do that as a friend. I especially love how you've helped Taylor do that, because he's much less dysfunctional having known you.
Wow.
Which is really helpful to me.
Yeah, still very dysfunctional. But no, I mean, Josh, it makes a lot of sense. If you are going for your goals, right? Goals are fantastic, but we have to be wise about what we are setting, how we are setting them, which is where a mentor or a leader or somebody to help us down that path, I think, is really helpful, right? Some community to be able to guide and direct that, if I hear you clearly. I wanted to go back and touch on one thing that you said, because I think we could run over it, and I think it's actually really important. I think it's actually something that we in the business world can often neglect, which is, you talked about one of the reasons that we struggle to grow is maybe this narrative that we tell ourselves. And I think often we can go, hey, we've got the roadmap, we've got the goals, we've got all these kind of things. But I want to hear a little bit more and just push in on that narrative. What are the narratives that you see that keep people back, right, from actually being able to grow or do whatever? Because even if we have a great plan, but we have a terrible narrative in our head, and I don't think we touch on this all that much, because in business, we're very goals and results driven, right? But I think I see a lot of people, and myself included, that may have this story in my head that's not helpful. So what does it mean? Like when you said, hey, we may have a narrative that isn't helpful for us, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one way to talk about it would be like categories. And actually, let me back up. I don't know that we can help but tell ourselves stories. I think we think in stories. And so that's just to start out the concept of like what narrative, what story are you telling yourself? Because we find ourselves existing in time. And so wanting to go from point A to point B is essentially story, right? In terms of using language to communicate meaning in who am I and what do I want and where am I headed, right? And what are the obstacles? So essentially, to answer your question, I think you could say shame-based narratives or stories. So shame, essentially, you could define it as a feeling or a trait or a state of not belonging.
Feeling, trait, or state.
Yeah, so and I should actually put state in front of trait if I want to order it well. So there's a gut feeling that you could just have in an instant, right? Of shame, of feeling that pit in your stomach of like, I'm essentially not valuable or not wanted here, not respected. And so it's that fundamental feeling that all humans have of not feeling worthy of love, not feeling belonging. And so that can go from feeling to a state where it's a little more extended. And as we practice that more, consciously or not, it grows into a trait, right? It's like a character trait that is relatively stable throughout our life, throughout situations and contexts. And so if we've experienced not belonging, which I think is part of the human experience, is we all have that. We can all think of times where we've been rejected or people have laughed at us as kids, right? And we can still remember those experiences, or something with our parents or a sibling, right? To where they're deeply painful experiences. And then we carry that with us throughout our life. And so part of then when we come to a new goal, say in business, and it's like, this has nothing to do with the feeling like I don't belong, right, on the surface. But if we're telling ourselves a story that I'm an imposter, say, like you've heard of imposter syndrome, right? Of this belief essentially that I don't have what it takes, I'm not worthy. In the counseling world, we would say that that's more a shame-based belief or narrative. So I think shame would be one, fear would be another, right? A fear-based narrative of focused on the perceived threats that is around us.
Sure. So essentially, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So I start telling myself this story, right? And the story stems from whatever has happened in my past. And maybe I don't even realize that I'm telling myself this story. Probably not. I'm not sure that they're always conscious, but sometimes they are.
Sure.
And the story is something along the lines of, either shame-based or fear-based, like I am a failure or I am destined to fail. Or if I'm not able to complete this work project, everybody around me will reject me, or I'll be fired and I'll be alone, whatever it is. And then that story gets caught on a loop, right? And if we keep telling ourselves over and over and over that story, that can really hinder us in terms of our capacity and ability to grow. Is that kind of the general idea there?
Yeah, exactly. So then you might not take the risk, or you make one mistake, you beat yourself up, and then maybe you don't try again, right? And so you then don't do what's necessary to grow. Or you may do it, but another would be like this is connected to shame, I think, but like an anger-based or a resentment-based narrative where you could categorize that in shame if you want, because you could also say shame is essentially anger turned inward, right? Where it's this disapproval of the self.
So I'm angry at me for not being the me that I think that I need to be. Wow. Is that right?
Yeah, and feeling that because other people don't love me, essentially, then I don't love myself.
Me either.
Yeah.
So you have to have a value for yourself in that.
If you want to flourish in life, then having a healthy value of self that you belong and have worth. And that's not to say that you don't also believe that you need to be responsible and work hard and things like that.
Yeah.
But to say, no, I do have worth, just like my friends have worth, right? And my heroes have worth. And so, and they don't have more, like, I believe we all have equal worth as humans, right? And there's not more achievements that you can do to increase your value or your worth.
Yeah. No.
And that's one of the other lies or narratives of, like, if I can accomplish this, then I'll be someone.
Totally.
Then I'll have, like, arrived, rather than going to gratitude for where am I today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
I know, man, all of that is stuff that, like, an internal battle that goes on for me on a pretty consistent basis. Some of the quotes that have really stuck with me over the years, I think Henry Ford said, hey, if you think you are, you are. And I found that really to be interesting with what you're sharing of, like, if I've got this loop and that's what I'm telling myself, then that is going to basically, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If I don't think that I have value, then I'm going to actually live into that, because my brain is a computer that's computing that over and over and over again. So if all I hear in my head is, you suck, you're never going to live up to it, you're never going to live up to it, well, then inevitably I may not live up to it. Is Stephen Furtick, I actually really like this quote. He said, the thoughts that you keep in a loop determine the direction of your life. And I thought that was really, really good. So this is part of the reason I think, and Brad, you can kind of pick it up here. Josh, you have a words of wisdom email that goes out that we subscribe to, podcast, all those kind of things. I feel like this is where wisdom really comes into play, to start to discern and understand, hey, do I need help? Right? Because, I may need help unpacking a lot of that. And kind of be, okay, what if these thoughts are true? What do I need to do with it? How do I go seek out somebody to help me with that, whether that's counseling or a leader in my business practice? But, like, if we're not wise with our thoughts, then we're not going to be fruitful often with our lives, right? And I know that that's true for me. It's a battle in my mind, and trying to be wise about that. So, Brad, I know we have a bunch of questions on wisdom.
Yeah, I think everything you both just said is really insightful, and I think it's very applicable for leaders today, especially the ones that we would characterize as being high performing. Maybe that's a large amount of employees under their stewardship. Maybe it's a large amount of financial resources under their stewardship. Maybe it's a role in which the stakes are very high, and the consequences for failure are pretty large. For example, they might completely lose a job, or they might lose a lot of money that they've invested in a project, for example. And so I think it's critical that we kind of move the conversation, now that we've talked about some of these issues, to understanding what is wisdom. So how would you define that and kind of shape our understanding of what wisdom is?
Simple question, but there's so much there. So I would, if we think about that question, what is wisdom? Where it's easy to start is, like, well, having good insight, right? Like the wise old man or the wise old grandma who has good insight because they have a lot of experience, and I think that's part of it. But good insight isn't enough, because if you use that good insight to hurt others, right?
Sure.
If you use it to take advantage of others, if you use that essentially power to oppress others, then I would argue that is not wise, right? And so that enters in essentially the concept of, in order to be wise, you actually also have to be good and actually live in a way that is not perfect, but is helpful, is beneficial to yourself, but not just yourself, to others. And that's where the idea of goodness, or you could say character, or the old word for it is virtue, comes in. So I would describe wisdom or define wisdom as virtuous skill in living. If I were to like summarize it most succinctly, wisdom is virtuous skill in living. So essentially, any context you find yourself in, do you live with character and to navigate that desire for the outcome, right? And that will even influence what your desired outcomes are, essentially. So that's how I would succinctly define what wisdom is.
Tell us just a little bit more about the concept of virtue. What is virtue? You've said why it's critical for wisdom, that you really can't have wisdom without it. But give our listeners a little bit more context on virtue.
So this is like essentially a concept that philosophers have been talking about since Aristotle and Plato. They really started the conversation, you could say, on virtue. And so since then, for over 2,000 years, in that ballpark, right? They, note to self, learn when they lived, because I don't exactly know what year they were born, and I should know that.
It's probably more like 3,000.
Yeah, thank you. I realize it's longer than 2,000, but I can't nail down the
specific
the dates.
Siri will tell you on your way
you get
home.
a pass.
Thank you.
Normally we'd ask Fred in the back. He's our little AI bot, but he's not working today. So
He took the day off.
It was Doug. Yeah, but if you haven't realized, I just make it up every time. So anyways, continue on, Josh.
The idea is that a virtue or a character trait is something that's relatively stable throughout different contexts, right? So you could take courage, or you could take being compassionate, or being humble, or whatever it might be. Any kind of character trait that I think also is good, right? Because if you are really cunning and good at hurting other people, we would call that more of a vice. So the old words are vice and virtue, right? So vice might be being lazy, or being selfish, or being fearful, cowardly, right? And those are relatively stable character traits, right? And we all are composed of different degrees of virtues and vices as humans, different things that we have practiced over time. That's why I say wisdom is virtuous skill, because it's something we practice. Like, we had to learn how to walk, we have to learn how to talk, we have to learn how to essentially be good and kind to others, right?
So let me interject here with another question that I think is really interesting. I hear a lot, especially employers, so like people who manage other people, or people who own companies and have employees, will say things, they'll use this phrase, well, people don't change, or you can't change someone. I hear you saying that virtue can be built, like it can be increased and improved. And the same is true for vice. Like, I can actually become more vicious if I try. Like, I can become worse than I currently am.
Oh yeah.
If I put my mind to it.
Absolutely.
But I can also become better. I can become more virtuous. So can people change? And what might that look like? I know this is a little bit off the path of what maybe we planned, but I think it's worth
it totally fits.
Just exploring for a second.
At a fundamental level, there's maybe different aspects of being human that are relatively consistent, right? So you could say, a relatively consistent personality type, right? Where you tend to think in a certain way, to learn in certain ways, to interact socially in certain pattern behaviors. So that may be what leaders mean, right? And I think there is truth to that. It's maybe more of a both and than an either or, right? And so it's true that there are certain aspects, like some people are more analytical in their thinking. Some people are more emotion first in their thinking, and they will resonate more with emotion, and someone else might be lost more with emotional words than with analytical words and ways of thinking. So that's not as likely to change. And yet, when we grow from vices to virtue over time, when we grow in our character, the ways that we think can change, and we can stop different limiting beliefs that we have of like, I'm not good at X, like I'm not good at math, I don't do well with people, whatever that narrative is that we have about ourselves can change completely. Mm-hmm. And so then, and it can go from like that negative fulfilling prophecy to completely the opposite of like, no, I actually am really good with people, or I love math, right? And if you enjoy something and you are telling yourself that feedback loop of a narrative that's life-giving, then you're going to want to do it, and you're going to be curious about it, and then you're going to engage in it and grow in the skill of that thing. It's not easy, so maybe that's what they're referring to, is they don't see it as much. And in business, you don't always have time to be focused on like what I'm talking about, of like deep personal development. There's not always you can't go to a business meeting and always have a therapy session. Essentially, like that's not.
And we've all experienced that team member that seems to turn business issues into a manifestation of their personal issues. And it's absolutely detrimental to achieving anything meaningful in any short amount of time. Yeah. So I agree with that completely.
Yeah. So there is the ability to change, but the change, I feel like it also doesn't happen often because it is slow and it is a grind. But there's a concept of like neuroplasticity, right? Of like, if my brain has been taught the same thing and it's done it over and over and over and over and over again, the brain can rewire itself, but it does take time and energy and effort. Sometimes we have that amount of time in business, right? Sometimes maybe we do. We've got time for a team member to grow. And sometimes maybe that growth is going to have to happen outside of the company's time.
That's right.
If it is detrimental to the team, and they don't have enough time to flex with that person to grow. But that doesn't mean that they can't grow. It just means...
I want to just, I guess I'm interrupting to say one aspect of in thinking through, one of the maybe the most valuable thing a leader can do, like the owner or CEO of a company can do, is hire great talent, right? Because it's the team that makes the product or the service and carries out the mission of the business. And so to that end, then it seems like it logically follows to, if you serve and take care of that team, if you're hiring well and you're hiring that talent well, then loving them well through difficulties of life is actually a really wise investment. But there is upfront cost in that. So if someone, let's say, develops an alcohol addiction, or they had it and you didn't catch it when you hired, it's really wise to love them well and to help them get help. It may be that you hired them and they're gifted enough to be hired, and we're doing 60% of what they're actually capable of doing. And so they already have all this knowledge of your business, and then you help them in a matter of months to maybe years, which isn't a short amount of time, but really in the life of a business, that's not that long. So in a matter of months to a few years, there's the potential that this person could experience radical growth and change and be producing at a whole nother level in your business.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the math on that is, cost to retain versus cost to rehire and retrain, right? Cost of retention versus cost of attrition.
And then be back in the same spot all over again with somebody else.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So I love your perspective, and I think it's very relevant for business owners.
And another way to think of it is like, what do I want to do with my life? Like, it's not just helping people pay their mortgage, right? It's we as leaders can actually help people grow in different ways. That's such one of the amazing things about being a business leader, is you get influence, like starting with your team first, right? And so I like to say, like, what kind of kingdom do you want to build, right? Because you get to set essentially the rules and the culture, and that's carried out by what you actually do and how you live out, not just, I mean, what you say is important, but what you actually do when you come across those opportunities is everything. And the company will learn over time, your people will learn what your character, what your values really are.
Yeah. I think this is a good foundation for continuing to talk a little bit about why leaders navigate this, either with wisdom or
no, I was thinking the same thing. I mean, Josh, I'm really curious, and I wanted to dive in a bunch on this today. Okay, so leaders tend to they've all got some kind of virtue and wisdom to a certain extent, right? But I think that Brad and I, as we were kind of preparing and thinking through this, one of the things, and I've experienced in my own life, because I'm now in recovery and had a journey to get there. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit is the nature to be a little bit more prone as kind of leadership and influence grows. It seems like there is more of a pronation, or can be, towards unhealthy coping measures, right? So addiction, acting out, those kind of things. Like typically, like we see a lot of these people, in the words of Notorious B.I.G., the famous,
well done.
More money, more problems, right? Or more responsibility, greater the responsibility, the greater the challenge, all those kind of things. So what I'd love to know is like, hey, why is it that if we have wisdom, if we have virtue, like we are still, as we grow in leadership and abilities and as a company grows, why is it we can tend to be more prone towards like addiction and shortcomings and kind of like falling off the wagon, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So the first answer I'll give is the caveat is it depends, because everyone's story is unique. So I hesitate to paint with too broad of a brush, but since you're asking that broadly, I'll go ahead and take out the big broad brush and start painting away.
Paint away, Picasso.
You were also a trained artist, which I didn't.
Yeah, that is true. So
not very
if you want to paint it back here on the wall for us, literally,
Paint
we'd be
away.
okay
we're
with
all
that.
in trouble if I do that at this point. So one way to think of it is the more driven you are to pursue something from point A to point B, it increases the likelihood that you might, if you aim at the wrong target, intentionally or unintentionally, then start pursuing that. Another way to think of it is often leaders have a big engine, right? They're high capacity, they have a lot of energy, there's a lot of intensity about their vision, their goals, right? Their drive. And so one thing we say when it comes to specifically a good amount of my work is with selfish sexual behavior and sex addiction. And so what we say is often people seek intensity rather than intimacy. And that doesn't have to be just with, say, pornography or a sex addiction. That can happen with alcohol or with whatever experience or substance that someone might pursue. Is that when experiencing success, they're seeking more and more experience, right? Because they may not be deeply content. And so in that process, it's like, well, what will change my mood? Something that's an intense experience is going to consistently change your mood, whether it's, again, any of these things. And you can essentially, anyone listening can say, what is the intense experience that is the go-to for me? It could be shopping, it could be alcohol. We all have these go-to experiences that are incredibly consistent and powerful at changing our mood, right? And so
I did confess to the air-fried jalapeno kettle chips in a recent episode.
It was a very deep confession.
So, yeah.
That's where it starts.
Yeah, that's the intensity there.
This is actually why we brought Josh in here today.
Is this an intervention?
This is we're wanting to talk about.
We're
your
gonna have
chip
to
problem.
stop recording right
Yeah,
now.
let's just go ahead and pause that.
Yeah,
Man, that is so helpful. So intensity rather than intimacy, drive and energy towards a specific goal. If it's the wrong one, the likelihood they're going to hit the wrong goal is still pretty high, even though it's the wrong goal. That is pretty eye-opening for me.
Yeah, the intensity, like that makes sense. I think that like when I'm thinking about that in terms of like if most leaders are intense and then they're looking for that either, you know, one way or another. So in their business or in an escape, you're still seeking the same thing. It just looks different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
A fun story, and I don't know if this is actually true and a thing, so you can fact check me on this, but a professor of mine once described it this way by saying the good old boys in the South, what they like to do is they get in their big trucks, they head out to the swamp, and they drive as deep into the mud as they can get in their truck, and then have a chain or whatever winch them out. And so the idea is the bigger the engine, the deeper you get stuck in the mud.
Yeah.
And I think that essentially describes this principle of leaders have big engines, as I said, right? And so they have a lot of drive, and so they're going to start pursuing that thing to seek out that change in their mood, to feel better, right? If they're suffering or they're feeling like they're not measuring up, if they are driven by shame, which is a really powerful driver for us as humans. It's not the most, you could say, successful driver, but it's a really powerful driver for us to seek approval, essentially.
Yeah.
And when we've experienced deep rejection, we have a big engine, we can seek out essentially accomplishment to earn meaning and value and worth. And when that's not doing enough, we can then seek out other experiences. Yeah. It's not that simple and always in that order and whatnot, but that's one way to think through it.
That's great. Yeah, and I like the big engine, right? And I think you see that like when you look across society and culture, like whether you're looking at, if you're religious, you're looking in the church world and you go, okay, here's this high performing person that we watch fall. If you look at sports, here's this high performing athlete that we watch, make all these choices that probably didn't line up with maybe even what their virtues were at the beginning, but they just kept driving into that mud and got deeper and deeper, and they've got a big engine, right? I think same in, politics, business, like you see that on a fairly consistent basis. I wonder too, if followers are looking for their leader to be that person so much that we also put the pressure on them.
Oh, I think that's exactly where my head was going. We put people on pedestals.
Yeah.
We incentivize them to perform, and then we wait and we watch for when they fail, and then we absolutely crucify them.
Yeah, then we just jump all over them.
And that's the stuff that gets the most views and clicks and likes. It's barbaric. But it is, I mean, can you speak to that? Can you speak to why I so badly...
It's your vices.
Yeah. Yeah, you're like, that's going to cost me. Actually, why do I so badly, incentivize the people that I'm following or my heroes to perform and then punish them so badly in my heart and mind and judge them so severely when they fail? Like, what is up with that?
It does seem like a very consistent part of human nature. Like you just see that throughout history, whether it was like, I was just watching on one of the streaming platforms, I think a 6-part series on the life of Alexander the Great, right? And he goes through this process of conquering the western part of Persia, the Persian Empire, and he gets down to Egypt and he essentially becomes Pharaoh. And so he is worshipped as a god in the Egyptian culture in that time, right? And so we do that in different ways, maybe in a modern way where we essentially worship the heroes that we have. And yet they're also like us. And so maybe we don't want them to be gods. Maybe we want to be like the God, right? And have the attention. But then to go back to getting deeper in the mud, when you start down that road as a leader, it can become very vulnerable, right? It's like the risk or at least the perceived risk to be known and to have whatever misstep that you have, right? Like that's part of that impacts your brand. It can impact your bottom line. And so there can be a lot of pressure to not actually deal with it, right? To not actually say, hey, this is an issue and I need help, or talk to people before it becomes the major issue.
Yeah, that's where I feel like we need
insightful.
Yeah, we need so much help. Is talking to people before it becomes an issue, but we have to feel safe enough to do that, right? And I think sometimes our leaders are on a pedestal, and so they don't feel safe enough to do that. Like safe enough to show that I bleed just a little bit, and then all of a sudden it's been 10 years and I'm bleeding a lot. I'm bleeding all over the place, and now everybody's going to find out.
Could you guys talk? I know you guys have talked about this extensively. A little bit about some of those key issues. I know there's at least 5 of them. The things that really trip us up and prevent us from flourishing.
Yeah. So I think what you're referencing is the 5 strongholds. So this is like a simple way to try to break down and summarize the vices. So essentially, different thinkers through human history have come up with different lists of vices and virtues. So my 5.
I'm thinking of like, this is like in the vein of like the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah, exactly.
More or less.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So the 5 that I have identified that seem to be fundamental across the board are: first, selfishness. Essentially, if I desire my gain over everyone else's gain, that causes all sorts of problems. And you can essentially tell that's my bias throughout everything I've said. Is like, my bias is that selfishness is not good. And I mean, I see this in my 4-year-old and my 1-year-old boys, right? Like they need to learn to actually share their toys, and that's a hard thing to learn. It's natural to just say it's mine, whether it
doesn't get easier, does it?
No, that's part of the process of growing in virtue, is saying like, oh, I'm not actually the most important, and what I want, it's meaningful, but it's not the most meaningful thing on earth. And other people's values, other people have meaning, and I get to serve them, and that actually makes my life better, right? So first vice would be selfishness. Then I identify the second as dishonesty, because essentially if you are deceiving other people, right, you don't have integrity, so you're not essentially like the same all the way through. You're showing up one way in one situation, another way in another situation, and inevitably that catches up to us. So it's not the most effective way to live, right? You can't have a good society, right, if you don't have like an honest justice system, right? Which kind of sounds like common sense, but if people aren't honest, then there's not justice. And that's true in the legal system, and just in friendship, in business, in marriage, in any way of relating to other people. So then there's anger, right? If I am, and anger can be healthy, right? Anger is essentially an emotion when a boundary is crossed, right? So something wrong, some injustice, a boundary has been crossed, and so then the natural human emotion is anger. But when you live in that anger, that we could summarize that as saying that's resentment, that story you tell yourself about the wrong that was done, right? Like, say it's at night, you're laying in bed, and you start playing the tape of the person that said that thing or did that thing to you, right? And we all have done that.
I call that ruminating.
Yeah.
Is that a right word for it? Like
that's a great one. Yeah. That's playing that tape, right? That narrative on a loop, right? And
I do that all the time. I hate that.
Yeah. So you could say that's resentment, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we feed that anger towards the wrong or the perceived wrong done to us, that's like a slow burn, and it leads to all kinds of things, just from increasing our stress and like higher blood pressure to all kinds of problems. So that's resentment, right? There's no peace essentially that we have in our life or you could say, to the degree that we have resentment, we lack peace. Something good
Well said.
to us can happen, and then we can essentially not enjoy it because we have resentment towards someone else and the wrong that was done, right? So that's resentment. Then there is fear, right? So fear is also a natural reaction to, in this case, to a perceived threat. But when fear is driving the bus, then not a lot of good things are happening, right? If we're making fear-based decisions. And so then the fifth is distorted thinking. So essentially, if we are not thinking what's true, we get into all kinds of trouble. And that could be like lies we are telling ourselves about ourselves. It could be lies we're telling ourselves about the world around us. If we're having irrational or distorted thinking, it's not helpful. So those are the five.
Okay, let's run through those again. So selfishness,
Mm-hmm.
we said dishonesty, anger, resentment.
Resentment is, I think I said anger, but it's really resentment is the
Okay, so
the
those
slow
two
burn.
go together.
Yep.
Okay, so selfishness, dishonesty, anger and resentment, fear,
and distorted thinking.
distorted
Good
thinking.
listening.
Okay.
Good listening.
Yeah. Wow. Look at that. You got that from a counselor.
But I
He
did
said
get
good
6
listening.
because I gave the 2 to, so it got a little weird.
Oh
but
yeah, you're performing. Do you need to talk about your performance right now, Brad?
I'm having a lot of performance anxiety.
Yeah,
right now.
that's fair. No, that's super.
Those are great.
Yeah, those are super great in terms of things that we really get caught up in.
I was reflecting on this with my wife Becca. We've been married for 9 years and change now, and when we got married, I had like 3 emotions, right? Very basic, and
That you could identify.
and I could say them very well.
Yeah.
Like, and then she had like 25, and I'd be like, I don't know what that word means. You just said a word, and I don't know what it means. And then I invested about $10 in an emotions wheel. And so between
I
Becca,
call it the wheel of feel.
the wheel. I invested in a wheel
Can
of
you
feel.
can you just define what a feeling wheel is for our listener?
It's basically it looks like a pie.
Yeah.
It's a piece of paper
Looks like the wheel of fortune.
that has a bunch of emotions on it, kind of in a circle, so kind of shaped in pieces of a pie. And so it helps you determine sort of these core feelings that are the ones that I knew about and could articulate, and how they sort of splinter out into much more nuanced versions of the same thing, specific versions of those same core feelings. And so Becca could very easily identify some of those kind of nuanced and specific feelings. So she could say like the difference between feeling disoriented and confused, whereas I'm like, I don't know, like that doesn't make sense to me. I can say that I don't get it, but through the process of being married to her for 9 years with someone with a very evolved ability to feel and dialogue about those feelings, like I've grown so much in my ability to even have these conversations. And so I share that story to say that like just the language of leaders the idea that we could empower, any leader who listens to this to have these kind of 5 strongholds language in their toolkit that they can pull out and they can say, oh, like I know what I'm doing right now. I'm being dishonest. Like, or I know this is disoriented thinking, or I'm ruminating on some resentment and anger that I have right now. I think that's powerful to change the culture of businesses and individuals' lives.
Yeah, it essentially, you could say, to the degree that you are living out a vice, it disconnects you from, I would say, from God, from self, and from others. Essentially, it disconnects you from everything. So it disconnects you from yourself, right? Like from a healthy way of connecting to yourself. And so, sometimes, especially among men, you may not have been raised to value emotions, to talking about emotions. That can be, for many men, that's seen as as weakness, right? Or not a masculine thing to do.
Yeah.
And so, and but what that ends up doing is we don't have a very rich inner map to our experience.
Yep.
So that then doesn't help us connect with our own experience as you're describing. And then also it limits how we can connect with others, right? If we don't understand our own emotions, how do we understand someone else's emotions? And how can you give empathy, right? And so empathy would be feeling alongside someone else, right? And that's not to like make their feelings stop, but to just feel with them becomes a very healing thing, and it communicates, maybe even non-verbally, that they belong, that they have worth. Part of how our brain develops is through language, right? And so when we have a new word for something, this doesn't need to be with feelings, but it certainly applies. If you have a new word for a thing, you essentially develop a new neural network, right, is formed around that. Like the neurons are firing and connecting. And I'm not a neurologist, so I'll explain it on layman's terms to just say as we have language for the world, then we can grow in understanding and in meaning, and then in taking meaningful action. And so as we have words for our feelings, we can identify them, and you could say you can, quote, feel and deal with life on life's terms, with the pain, with the upsets, instead of going to circle back to like addiction or the intense experiences, instead of seeking these intense things that take us out of the moment, right, that disconnect us from ourselves. We can actually be present. We can feel the thing. It might not be pleasant, but then we can just move on in our life. Because the goal isn't, like, it's impossible to avoid unpleasant feelings. That's not or if that's the goal, you won't be successful, right?
Yeah, impossible goal.
And so it's learning to feel, make meaning of it, right? That's the dealing with it, and moving forward according to your values.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great almost bow on today. The truth is, I think with Josh being here, we could be talking about this for hours, but we're running up on time here. So we're definitely going to have Josh back at least once, if not part 2, part 3, part 4, because I think there's so much to really unpack there of what you're just talking about.
Yep.
Of helping people walk in wisdom, understanding when they're leveraging into their strongholds, and hopefully rather than going into unhealthy coping mechanisms, we can lean into community, we can lean into virtue, we can lean into the more of the person that we want to be, right? In that vein, I know Josh, this will be on our show notes, but what's the best way if people wanted to find you, follow you, where are you at? Can you just tell them real quickly? I know you've got like Instagram.
It's not super important. I love that question, but let me circle back first to one. I want to make this a little practical for people. So one like exercise that people could do is a daily reflection practice of just sitting for say 5 minutes in the morning, at night, whenever works for you, when you feel most calm and present, to just reflect on that day or the previous day and identify, did I experience any of these strongholds? And then essentially surrender them. So for me, as a Christian, I would surrender them to God in prayer. But this is a ancient practice that St. Ignatius of Loyola started, called the Daily Examen in the 1500s, I think. So essentially, you can just take time each day to reflect on, did I go to any of these 5 strongholds? And then work through them. Talk to someone if you need to talk. Journal if you need to journal to externalize the thought, and that will help your brain and your body actually process the thoughts and the feelings more, so that then you don't stay up at night ruminating longer, right? Because you have, and it can still happen, but it will decrease the amount that you are doing that if you develop that reflection process. If you want bonus points, then share that with 1 or 2 of your most trusted friends, and challenge them to do the same, so that then it's like creating this feedback loop, so they get to know you and your stuff, You get to know them. You can support them throughout life.
Yeah.
So there's a practical way.
That's super good.
You can find me on joshkalsbeek.com or my Instagram if I remember correctly, because I have an Instagram, but I block it so I don't personally go on Instagram because
That's
It's
awesome.
probably that's very smart. Yeah.
Yeah.
it's joshkalsbeek.lmft.
Cool. And just for the sake of the listeners, and so that you know, I personally receive a ton of value from your Instagram. I think the things that you're posting, not that I know that you don't know what they are, but they
I
are
do know
awesome.
what they are.
They're awesome.
There's this thing with technology where you can actually post on Instagram without being on Instagram.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
It's great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I need
Well,
to
same
find
with
that.
same with your podcast, same with your email that you put out, your words of wisdom email.
Oh, that's great.
Man, there's so much good stuff there, man. So we're super grateful.
Josh, thank you.
Yeah, man. Thank you for being here today, for sharing.
Maybe next time we can turn the tables and we can ask you guys questions.
Ooh, no, we
as in
don't.
me.
No,
I, would
I don't
love
think.
that.
I don't want to
think
darken
anybody
anyone's
wants that.
understanding.
Yeah,
Have a couple
Brad's gonna go
session.
real dark. Yeah,
Yeah. I don't want to dim anyone's light.
that's right. Yeah,
That's why.
We'd be
That's
afraid.
That's
why we bring in
ask
the
questions.
Why
professionals.
don't
Right.
you listeners put any questions that you have for Brad
All
and
right.
Taylor
Oh, wow.
in the
Jesus cut his
comments.
mic.
Yeah, yeah.
in the comments, and
And
I would
with
love
that-
to ask them those questions, and we can go to the dark
Let's
places.
go. Let's go.
That's
I love
awesome.
it, man. I love it. Well,
All right.
hey, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of The Daily Leader, and we will see you next time.
Like, subscribe, share, comment.
Do all those things.
See you next time.